He was the king of the underworld, a man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of the entire city. She was an arranged bride, carrying only a single suitcase and eyes that never dared to meet his. This marriage wasn't love, not a choice, just a cold transaction between two powerful families. But that night, the night he walked into the room and found her huddled on the cold, hard wooden floor, everything changed. Not because he softened, but because for the first time in his life, Riker Voss saw a wound deeper than any he had ever inflicted. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from. Let me know how far this story has come. The car rolled through the iron gates of Blackthorn Manor at 9:11 on a Thursday evening, and the rain was already coming down hard enough to blur the headlights into smears of pale yellow against the wet asphalt. The estate sat 3 miles outside the city proper, up a private road lined with oak trees so old their roots had cracked the pavement years ago, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Power didn't need to apologize for its roads. Riker Voss stood at the second-floor window watching the black sedan pull into the circular drive. He had a glass of bourbon in his right hand, untouched, the ice already melting into the amber. He wasn't drinking tonight. He was waiting. His head of security, a man named Dax, who had 17 years of loyalty and a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least twice, appeared in the doorway behind him. "She's here," Dax said. "I can see that." "You want me to, no." Riker didn't turn around. "Tell the staff to show her to the East Wing suite. Have someone bring her food. Something warm." He paused. "And tell them to knock first." Dax hesitated one beat too long. Riker turned then, just slightly. "What?" "Nothing, sir." "Say it." The big man shifted his weight. "She's 23. I pulled her file when your lawyer sent over the marriage contract. She's never, from what we can tell, she's never left the Vale estate for more than a few hours at a time." He stopped. "Just seems young is all." Riker looked back at the window. The car door had opened. A slight figure stepped out into the rain, and whoever had been driving made no move to offer an umbrella. She stood there for a moment in the downpour, one hand gripping a single dark suitcase, and she looked up at the manor the way people look at things they are afraid of but have already accepted. "She's not a child," Riker said quietly. "She's a transaction. Make sure she's comfortable." He turned away from the window before she reached the front steps. The Vale family had come to him 6 weeks ago through an intermediary, a lawyer named Costello who wore shoes that cost more than most people's rent and never made eye contact when delivering uncomfortable news. The arrangement had been presented as a merger of interests. The Vale name carried political weight, old money connections, a veneer of respectability that Riker's organization occasionally required when doing business above the surface. Riker's resources, in turn, would protect certain Vale financial interests from the kind of scrutiny that came when you'd been skimming from charitable foundations for 11 years. He hadn't wanted a wife. He'd made that clear. But Costello had smiled his thin smile and said that some deals were architecture, not transaction. You built them because they held up other things, and Riker had understood what wasn't being said. The Vale patriarch, a man named Edmund Vale, had enough political connections to create regulatory problems for 3 of Riker's legitimate front operations if the deal fell through. And Riker was not, at this point in his life, in a position to wage 2 wars simultaneously, so he'd signed the contract. He hadn't met her before the courthouse, hadn't spoken to her during the brief civil ceremony attended by lawyers and witnesses, and no one who could be called family in any meaningful sense. She had stood beside him in a gray dress that looked like it had been chosen to make her invisible, said the words when told to say them, and kept her eyes on the middle distance the entire time. He'd noticed her hands. They were folded in front of her, and they were very still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. That's the result of a person having learned to keep very still because movement drew attention, and attention was dangerous. He'd noticed that, filed it away, said nothing. The manor had 22 rooms. He'd given her the East Wing, which had its own bathroom, a sitting area with south-facing windows, and a door that locked from the inside. He'd made sure of that last part specifically. He wasn't sure why. Old habit, maybe. The same instinct that made him always know where the exits were. She settled into the East Wing and disappeared. That was the only word for it. She was present, Staff confirmed they brought her meals, that the trays came back empty, that lights were on in the suite through the night. But she generated no noise, no requests, no presence. She moved through the manor's shared spaces like she was trying not to disturb the air. When the housekeeper, a stout woman named Vera, who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them, mentioned that the new Mrs. Voss had apologized for using too much hot water during her shower, Riker had looked up from his desk. She apologized. 3 times, Vera said, with an expression that mixed pity and something sharper. Said she'd try to be quicker in the future. I told her the manor has 4 water heaters, and she could use all of them simultaneously for a week without anyone noticing. She looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. Riker had gone back to his paperwork. The arrangement was simple. They were legally married. They occupied the same estate. They were not required to interact beyond what was necessary for appearances. A few public events per year, perhaps, depending on what Edmund Vale's political calendar required. He had made this clear to her via a document his lawyer delivered the day after the ceremony, clean, transactional, respectful of her time and his. He had no reason to enter the East Wing. He entered it 3 weeks later because Dax brought him an intercepted communication that required immediate attention, and the file was upstairs on his private server, and the fastest route was through the East Wing corridor, past the sitting room, and up the back staircase. He wasn't looking in the room. The door was slightly ajar and the light was off, and he was moving fast, and his eye caught the shape on the floor simply because his eye caught everything. That was the function of being alive in his particular profession for as long as he had been alive in it. He stopped. She was on the floor beside the bed, not on it, beside it. Curled on her side on the hardwood, one arm tucked under her head, covered by a single blanket she'd pulled from the foot of the mattress. The bed itself was immaculate, untouched, pillows arranged exactly as the housekeeper would have left them. He stood in the doorway for approximately 4 seconds. Then he went upstairs, got the file, and didn't mention it to anyone. But the next evening, after dinner, he told Vera to check the East Wing room. Vera came back 20 minutes later. Her expression was doing something complicated. "The bed," he said. "Hasn't been slept in," Vera confirmed. "I checked the sheets. They're exactly how I made them 5 days ago." She paused. "She's sleeping on the floor, Mr. Voss." "I know." "Should I... Do you want me to say something to her?" "No." He thought for a moment. "Bring a better blanket, something heavier. Don't make it a conversation." Vera nodded and left. He told himself it was practical. A staff member sleeping, a resident sleeping, on a hardwood floor was a liability. Back problems. Health issues. It was management, not sentiment. He managed to believe this for about 4 days. On the 5th day, he was passing the East Wing again, and this time he stopped deliberately, and this time he knocked on the doorframe. She was awake, sitting at the small writing desk near the window, some book open in front of her, and she turned when he knocked and immediately stood. The movement automatic and fast, the kind of fast that comes from practice. From expecting that when someone appears at your door, the appropriate response is to get vertical and stay alert. "Sit down," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. She sat down slowly, watching him. He came into the room. It was his house, and yet he was aware of the dynamic, aware that he was physically larger and standing while she was seated, and that everything about the way she was holding herself said she was managing fear. He pulled the small chair out from the wall and sat across from her, and he said, "The bed." Her expression didn't change. "I'm sorry?" "You're sleeping on the floor every night. Why?" A pause. She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I didn't think it would be noticed." "Everything in this house is noticed. That's not an answer." The silence stretched. Outside, the rain was starting again. It had rained almost every night since she'd arrived, which struck him periodically as improbable, and which he never commented on because he was not a man who commented on weather. "I wasn't permitted to sleep in beds," she said finally. Her voice was even. No performance in it, no bid for sympathy. Just a flat delivery of a fact she had apparently decided she might as well state. "Growing up, it was a rule." He looked at her. "In my father's house," she added, as if clarifying. He kept his face expressionless. He was very good at this, had spent decades learning to receive information without broadcasting reaction, because reaction was leverage, and you didn't hand leverage to anyone. But something moved in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. "The bed in this room," he said carefully, "belongs to you. The room belongs to you. You can sleep wherever you choose. But the floor is not, it's not required." She nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Another pause. She was looking at him with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite hope, somewhere in the bruised territory between the two. "I'll try," she said. He stood up, moved the chair back against the wall with more precision than the action required, and left. 3 nights later, Vera confirmed that the bed still hadn't been touched. He didn't know why it bothered him the way it bothered him. He had done things in his life, ordered things, permitted things, looked away from things, that should have insulated him against being troubled by the particular suffering of one small woman sleeping on a floor. The geography of his conscience had been deliberately simplified over the years. You chose your territory and you defended it, and you didn't expand the borders, because expanded borders meant more exposure, more vulnerability, more things that could be used against you. But he kept thinking about her hands, the stillness of them. He told Dax, the following Monday, to pull whatever information existed on the internal operations of the Vale estate, not the financial records. Those were already in his files. The internal operations, staff turnover, incident reports, any documentation from the household that had made its way into external records. Dax looked at him. "Do it quietly," Riker said. The files came back in 4 days. Dax left them on his desk without comment, which was its own kind of comment. He read them on a Tuesday night, alone in his study, with the bourbon he'd been not drinking for 3 weeks finally getting used. The documentation was incomplete. The Vale family had money and lawyers and the specific expertise of people who had spent years making inconvenient records disappear. But what remained was enough. She'd had a tutor until age 12, then nothing. No school records, no extracurricular activities, no medical visits outside the estate's private physician, no documented social contact outside a small handful of approved family events. One incident report from a household staff member who had been terminated 2 days after filing it, describing what she'd witnessed in the east hallway of the Vale residence on an unspecified evening. The staff member's account was 2 pages. Someone had redacted portions of it with black marker, but not well enough. You could still read fragments. He closed the file. He sat for a while in the dark. Then he called Dax and told him to conduct a full review of security arrangements for the East Wing, including personnel, who was on overnight rotation, response times, the whole structure. Dax said he'd have a report by morning. Riker said fine. He hung up and sat for another while longer. The next morning, he found Serafina at breakfast for the first time. She had apparently been taking meals in her suite consistently, but that morning she was in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, the kitchen, sitting at the counter with coffee and something Vera had made that involved eggs, and she looked startled when he walked in and started to get up. "Don't," he said. She stopped, hovering. "Sit down, finish eating." He got himself coffee and stood at the counter at a distance that was not threatening. He was thinking about that, actually, thinking about angles and proximity in a way he hadn't thought about things since he was younger and learning to read rooms, and said, without preamble, "You're going to be introduced to the staff this week, formally, as the lady of the house." He looked at his coffee. "Vera will walk you through the household accounts, what we spend, what we need, what gets ordered. You'll have authority over decisions about the domestic side of operations. If you want to change anything, you change it." She was very still. "This is your home," he said. "Not temporarily, not provisionally. Your home." She looked at her coffee cup. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "You read something." He said nothing. "About my family." She wasn't asking. He drank his coffee. She nodded slowly, and something moved through her expression. Not quite humiliation, not quite relief, something in between that had no clean name. "I didn't expect," she said carefully, "to be believed." He put his cup down on the counter. "I don't make decisions about what I believe until I have information. Now I have information." He left the kitchen. Behind him, he heard Vera's voice, low and warm, saying something he couldn't make out. He didn't need to. He kept walking. Over the following 2 weeks, things shifted by degrees. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, no single moment of transformation, no clean before and after, just the accumulation of small changes that Riker observed from the particular distance he maintained between himself and everything he didn't want to examine too closely. Serafina began appearing in shared spaces. She spent time in the library. He noticed the books she pulled from the shelves, the way she handled them carefully, like objects that might be taken away. She started taking her meals in the dining room. She spoke to Vera in full sentences. He watched her, one afternoon from the upper landing, show Vera something she'd sketched. An arrangement for the garden, apparently, something with the unused east-facing beds. And Vera had responded with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for ideas she'd been waiting years for someone to have, and Serafina had smiled. He hadn't seen her smile before. He'd walked away before she looked up. His organization's business continued around all of this the way weather continues, regardless of what's happening at ground level. 3 distribution networks to manage, 2 ongoing negotiations with associates in the Port Authority, a territorial dispute that was threatening to become expensive if he didn't intervene personally before the end of the month. He gave these things his full attention because they required it, and because the work had always been the structure that held everything else in shape. But twice a week, without planning it, he found himself eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of his office. And the conversations they had there, if you could call them conversations, they were more like 2 people occupying the same silence with occasional breaks in it, were becoming something he didn't have a clean category for. She asked him one morning why the oak trees along the drive had never been pruned. "Nobody gets around to it," he said. "They're cracking the road." "I know." "I could contact a specialist if you want." He looked at her. "Why do you care about the oak trees?" She considered this seriously, like it was a question worth considering. "I've been looking at them every morning from the east window. They're old. Someone planted them a long time ago because they thought this would be a home for a long time." She paused. "I think that deserves some maintenance." He said he'd have Dax look into a specialist. She nodded and went back to her coffee. It was a month after she arrived, on a rain-soaked Wednesday night when Riker was returning from a meeting that had run 3 hours longer than it should have, that he came back to the manor and went upstairs and past the East Wing corridor and stopped. Her door was open wider than usual. The light from inside was dim, just the small lamp on the desk, and he could see her from the corridor. She was asleep. On the floor again, beside the bed, in the same position as every other night, the heavy blanket he'd had Vera leave pulled up to her chin. He stood there for longer than 4 seconds this time. He thought about the files, the redacted pages. The staff member who'd filed a report and lost her job in 2 days. The tutor who had disappeared from the records at age 12. The medical visits that had stopped. The way she flinched, still, when someone appeared in a doorway without warning. The way she'd said I wasn't permitted to sleep in beds in a voice stripped of everything except the flat delivery of fact. He went to his own suite at the far end of the hall. He lay down. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, and then his phone rang. Dax. Calling at 12:47 in the morning, which meant it wasn't about the oak trees. "We have a problem," Dax said. "What kind?" "The kind that involves Edmund Vale, and a phone call he made tonight to someone you're going to want to know about." Riker sat up. The ceiling above him was dark and still, and the rain was hitting the windows the way it had been hitting them for weeks, and something cold settled into his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. "Tell me," he said, and Dax told him. And by the time he hung up the phone, Riker Voss understood that whatever this arrangement had been, transaction, architecture, management, it was becoming something he hadn't planned for and couldn't fully control. And Edmund Vale had just made the worst decision of his life. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Riker set the phone face down on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed with his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he breathed through his nose the way he'd trained himself to breathe when information arrived that required a recalibration of everything he thought he understood about a situation. Edmund Vale had made a call at 10:43 that evening to a man named Carver Moss. Riker knew Carver Moss the way you knew a smell before you could identify its source. By instinct first. information second. Moss ran political logistics for a network of city officials who specialized in making regulatory problems appear and disappear depending on which direction the money was flowing. He wasn't muscle. He was architecture. He made legal structures that looked like walls but functioned like traps. The content of the call, according to the intercept Dax's team had pulled, involved the marriage contract. Specifically, a clause in the original Vale family trust, language that Edmund's lawyers had apparently inserted and that Riker's lawyers had not flagged because it had been buried in a subsection of an inheritance document that referenced a separate document that had not been included in the primary filing. The clause gave Edmund Vale the right to petition for the dissolution of any marriage contracted by a Vale family member under the age of 25 if it could be demonstrated that the marriage had occurred under conditions of, and here the legal language got specific, diminished autonomous consent, which was a phrase that could mean almost anything when you had the right judges and the right paperwork and a daughter who had spent her entire life inside walls that her father controlled. Riker sat in the dark and understood what was happening. The arrangement had never been about alliance. It had been about money, specifically about the inheritance Serafina would receive at 25 from her maternal grandmother's estate, a trust that Edmund Vale could not touch as long as it went directly to Serafina, but could absolutely redirect if Serafina's marriage was invalidated and she was returned to his custody before the distribution date. 7 months away. The marriage had been Edmund's play. Get her legally attached to someone without her actually gaining independence, keep the clock from running, and when the moment was right, pull the thread. Riker had been used. That was the part that sat in his chest like a coal. He didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night in his study going through documents with 2 of his in-house legal analysts, mapping the clause structure, identifying where the filings had gone and who had received copies. By 4 in the morning, he had a functional picture of the trap and 3 possible responses to it. At 6:15, he heard movement in the corridor, light footsteps, the soft sound of the kitchen door. He closed the files on his desk, stood up, and went downstairs. She was at the counter with her hands around a coffee mug, standing at the window that looked east toward the garden and the old oak trees, and the early light was coming through thin and gray and making her look like something that had been there a long time without anyone noticing. She turned when she heard him and registered something in his face that made her set the mug down. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, just 2 words laid flat on the counter between them. He pulled out the stool and sat down. He thought about how to say it, and then decided the architecture of how to say it was less important than the content. "Your father made a call last night to a political contractor named Carver Moss. Do you know that name?" She shook her head once. "He runs influence operations for city officials, judges, regulators, that kind of infrastructure." Riker folded his hands on the counter. "Your father is moving to have the marriage invalidated. There's a clause in your family trust that lets him petition for dissolution under certain legal conditions. He's building the case." She was very still. That particular stillness. "He wants you back before your 25th birthday," Riker said, "because of the Calloway Trust, your grandmother's estate." Something moved through her face. Not surprise, which he noted, but a kind of exhausted recognition, like hearing a diagnosis you'd suspected for years. She looked at the window. "I wondered," she said quietly, "when he agreed to the marriage. I thought, he never does anything without a reason. I thought there was something I wasn't seeing. There was. How much time do we have before he files?" Riker looked at her. She was looking back at him now, and her eyes were steadier than he expected. Not calm exactly, but focused, the way a person looks when fear has been present long enough that it stops being an emergency and starts being a condition you work inside of. "Weeks," he said. "Maybe less. It depends on how quickly Moss can assemble the filing and which judge they're planning to approach." She nodded. She picked up her coffee mug and held it without drinking from it. "What do you need from me?" He was quiet for a moment. "I need to know everything about the conditions of your life in that house. Not the broad version. Everything." She set the mug down again and looked at her hands and didn't say anything for long enough that he thought she was going to deflect. Then she said, "I'll need to sit down." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Vera arrived at 7:30, took one look at the room, made coffee she left on the counter without comment, and disappeared. Whatever Serafina said, she said in a flat, even voice, the kind of voice that had learned to report facts without emotional weather around them, because emotional weather had historically made things worse. Riker asked questions, specific ones. She answered them. By 9 o'clock, he had what he needed. Not everything. There were gaps she either couldn't remember clearly or wouldn't access yet, and he didn't push, but enough of a structural picture that his legal team could work with it. He called Dax from the kitchen table, gave him a list of names and a set of instructions, and hung up. Serafina was looking at the table. "This is going to become complicated," he said. "It's already complicated." "More complicated, then. There may be people who approach you, staff at events, people who seem incidental, anyone your father might use to observe your behavior or create a narrative." She looked up. "How do I know who they are?" "You don't. So you assume everyone is observable and behave accordingly." She absorbed this. "You mean behave like a wife?" "I mean, behave like a person who chose to be here, which, regardless of how this started, is the current legal position that needs to be supported." Something flickered across her face. He couldn't read it completely. She said, "And if I can't convince people of that?" "That's not a you problem," he said. "That's a documentation problem. We're building the documentation." She was quiet for a moment. "You're very practical about this." "It's a practical situation. My father tried to end a marriage I've been in for 4 weeks by exploiting language his lawyers hid in a document your lawyers never saw, and you're calling it practical." He looked at her. There was something in her voice he hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, more like the thin edge of something that had been patient a very long time and was beginning to run out of patience. "What would you like me to call it?" he said. "I'd like you to be angry," she said. "I've been angry about it my entire life, and I've never been allowed to say so. You've been angry about it for 6 hours, and you're sitting there like you're reading a weather report." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything beyond what this is," she said. "I know what this is. But he does this. He has always done this. He takes every situation and he folds it into something that looks reasonable from the outside, and everyone around him adjusts to it, and I have spent 23 years adjusting to it, and I would just like someone to say out loud that it's wrong." Riker sat with that. "It's wrong," he said. She exhaled. A small sound. Then she picked up her coffee mug, and this time she drank from it. The days that followed had a different texture. The household continued its rhythms, meals, maintenance, the ordinary machinery of a large estate. But underneath it ran a current that everyone could feel and nobody named directly. Riker's security presence increased without fanfare. There were simply more people doing more things with more attentiveness. 2 of his legal analysts moved into one of the guest wings temporarily. There were phone calls he took in his study with the door closed. He watched Serafina navigate the change. She adapted the way she seemed to adapt to most things, by observing the new parameters carefully and adjusting her movement within them without complaint. She was intelligent in a way that had clearly survived everything it had been put through, which struck him as something close to remarkable when he let himself think about it, which he tried not to do too frequently because it led to a kind of reflection he didn't have a designated space for. She spent time with the legal analysts going through records. The documents she could access from her years in the Vale estate were limited, but not nothing. She had kept things, she told him one evening, small things, items that had seemed insignificant at the time, but that had accumulated into a pattern. Letters. Scheduling records. A log she'd kept for 3 years starting at age 16, writing dates and events in a handwriting so small it was almost invisible, because she'd learned early that documents stored in her room were subject to inspection. He read the log. He sat with it for a long time after. Dax came to him on the 9th day with a name he didn't expect. A woman named Iris Tan, a staff member who had joined the manor's household 3 weeks ago as an assistant to the head groundskeeper. Dax's team had run her background and found a thread, thin but there, connecting her previous employment to a property management company that shared a registered agent with one of Edmund Vale's shell entities. Riker told Dax to watch her, not move on her yet. He wanted to see what she was looking for. He didn't tell Serafina immediately. He was calibrating how much of the operational detail to share with her, trying to find the line between keeping her informed and turning her fear into a weapon against her own stability. She was building something fragile and necessary, and he didn't want to undermine it before it had structural integrity. He told her on the 11th day. She was in the library when he came in. She was standing at the shelves with a book open in her hands, but she wasn't reading it, just holding it, looking at the page without seeing it. She turned when she heard him. He told her about Iris Ton, flat and direct, the way he'd told her everything. She closed the book. She set it on the shelf with precise care. She said, "She watched me in the garden on Wednesday. I thought she was just curious." She stopped. I told her about the oak tree project, the pruning specialist. We talked for 20 minutes. That's fine. That's nothing that hurts us. She asked me if I was happy here. He said nothing. I told her yes. Her voice was very even. I said yes because I've gotten better at saying things that are true. I am... She stopped again. I think I am. I think I'm starting to be. And that's strange because 2 months ago I didn't think I was allowed to be. He stood in the doorway of the library, and the afternoon light was coming through the tall windows, and dust moved slowly through it, and he thought about the files and the log, and the redacted staff report, and the 2 hours in the kitchen, and the way she'd said I would just like someone to say out loud that it's wrong. "You're allowed to be," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why it's strange. Knowing something and believing it are different." He understood this more than he was prepared to say. The confrontation with Iris Ton came on the 14th day, and Riker hadn't planned it for that morning, but the morning brought it regardless. He was in the East Garden with Dax when the woman came around the south path with a set of clippers and a schedule that had her nowhere near that section until Thursday. Dax met his eye. Riker gave a small nod. When Dax's people moved to intercept her, Iris Ton made the specific kind of mistake that told Riker everything he needed to know about what she'd been hired to do. She went for her phone first. Not to run, not to protest. The phone. She was in one of the interior rooms by mid-morning. Riker sat across from her at the table and asked her 3 questions. She answered the first 2 with denials. On the third question, what was she supposed to document, specifically? She looked at him with the calculation of someone assessing whether the cost of lying was worth it, and then she said, evidence that she was under duress, that she didn't want to be here, that the marriage wasn't, that she didn't consent. He said, "And is that what you found?" She was quiet. "Is that what you found?" he said again, not louder, lower. She said, "No." He had her removed from the property and her phone forensically imaged before she got to the gate. His legal team had the content mapped within 4 hours. She'd sent 7 transmissions over 2 weeks. 2 of them had included audio, short clips from the garden, from the front hall, a conversation she'd captured through a window. He listened to all of it, his own voice in one clip, talking to Dax in the driveway about the oak tree specialist, Seraphina's voice in another, in the garden, talking to Iris about the plans for the east beds and the spring planting schedule and what she hoped the place would look like in a year. What she hoped the place would look like in a year. He sat with that phrase in his chest for a while. He went to find her. She was in the kitchen, standing at the counter in the same place he'd first talked to her about all of this, and when he came in, she looked at his face and said, "How bad?" She sent audio, 7 transmissions, but the content doesn't help his case. If anything, it creates a record of you describing a home you're invested in, planning for the future here, speaking freely. He stopped. It backfired on him. She nodded slowly. "But he knows we found her," Riker said, "which means he knows we're aware of the operation, which means the timeline just moved." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll escalate." "Yes." "He always escalates when he loses a play." Her voice was flat in that particular way. "When I was 17, I hit a phone, an old one, prepaid. I'd saved up small amounts from household money for 8 months to buy it. When he found it, She stopped. Something moved through her jaw. The escalation lasted 3 weeks. Riker stood very still. "He'll come at this harder," she said, "and faster. He doesn't like being countered." She looked at Riker with an expression that was steady, but cost her something to hold. "Are we ready for that?" He was about to tell her yes, They were positioned well. His team had contingencies. And then Dax appeared in the kitchen doorway with his phone held out and an expression that Riker had seen on his face exactly twice in 17 years, and neither time had preceded good news. "There's been an incident," Dax said. "Costello, your lawyer. He was found at his office an hour ago. Someone went through his files." He paused, and his jaw was tight. "He's been moved to Mercy General. It's not... He'll survive. But they were looking for something specific, and from what we can tell, they found it." Riker's entire chest went cold. "The original marriage contract," he said. Dax nodded once. "The clause. The original filing with the sub-document attached. The full paper trail." The kitchen was very quiet. He could hear the rain starting outside again. He could hear his own pulse steady and hard. Edmund Vale had just broken the surface. Whatever the last 2 weeks had been, maneuvering, positioning, a Cold War conducted through proxies, it was over. The man had moved against a member of Riker's legal team, had authorized an assault on someone under his organizational protection. That was not a calculation. That was a declaration. Riker turned to Serafina. She was already watching him. She had already understood from his face and Dax's face and the specific quality of the silence in the room what the information meant. "I need you to stay in the manor," he said. "Not the grounds. Inside. With 2 of my people in your wing at all times." "What are you going to do?" He held her eyes for a moment. "My job." She reached out and put her hand on his arm. The contact was brief and deliberate, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had learned very late that asking people to be careful was not a weakness. "Don't let him make you into something you'll regret," she said quietly. He looked at her hand on his arm. He didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the kitchen with Dax, and as he moved through the manor's corridors toward his study, toward the phones and the files and the machinery of a response that Edmund Vale had just made unavoidable, he carried her voice with him like a splinter under the skin. "Don't let him make you into something you'll regret." And the problem, the real problem, was that he was no longer certain where that line was, or whether he was already standing on the wrong side of it, and the rain outside was coming down hard, and the city beyond the Iron Gates was about to learn something about what it meant when Riker Voss stopped being patient. Riker's study had 3 phones, and he used all of them in the first 40 minutes. The bourbon from 2 nights ago was still on the desk, and he moved it to the windowsill without drinking it and stood with his back to the room while he worked through the call list, his lead attorney, the backup firm on retainer, 2 contacts in the city's administrative structure who owed him specific and documented favors, and finally a man named Pruitt, who ran security forensics and could reconstruct what had been taken from Costello's office down to the individual page. Dax sat in the corner chair and said nothing unless spoken to. This was one of his qualities Riker valued most. By the time the calls were done, the rain outside had moved from steady to something harder, and the window glass was vibrating slightly in its frame. Riker turned around and sat at his desk and looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. "Costello's people," he said. "They know what was taken." The original contract with the sub-document, 43 pages of the trust language, the clause in full, and... Dax stopped. And a separate document, something Costello had filed internally, not part of the official submission. He pulled out his phone and read from it. A supplemental memo. His own notes on the marriage negotiation, including his assessment at the time that the sub-document clause represented a significant legal vulnerability, and his recommendation that you reject the deal. Riker went very still. "His recommendation that you reject it," he said. "Which you didn't receive," Dax said, "because someone on Costello's staff pulled the memo before it went out. It never reached you." The room was quiet except for the rain and the low hum of the building's heating system. "Who?" Riker said. "We're working on it." "Work faster." He stood up and moved to the window. The grounds below were empty, wet. The security lights turning the puddles on the drive into flat mirrors. Someone on his side had intercepted a memo. Someone with access to Costello's internal communications had made sure Riker walked into the Vale arrangement without the one piece of information that would have made him refuse it outright. He had spent 17 years building an organization on the premise that loyalty was the only currency that didn't inflate. He paid well, promoted carefully, And when trust was broken, he was thorough and final about the consequences. In 17 years, he had been betrayed twice. Both times he had seen it coming by the time it arrived. Both times there had been tells he'd been watching for. This time he hadn't seen anything. That was the part that sat behind his sternum like a stone. He didn't sleep that night either. At 3 a.m, he walked the corridor past the east wing out of something he didn't examine closely. And the light under Serafina's door was on, and he almost knocked, and then didn't, and went back to his study and worked until 6. Pruitt's forensic report arrived at 7:42 the next morning by encrypted transfer. Riker read it at his desk with coffee going cold beside him. The reconstruction of what had been taken from Costello's office was precise. Pruitt was precise. It was what he cost. And buried in the access log analysis was a detail that required him to read the paragraph 3 times before he let himself register what it said. The breach at Costello's office had not been an external entry. The security footage showed 2 men entering through the lobby using a valid access code. The code had been issued internally from within the building's administrative system. Someone with authorized access to Costello's building had provided entry to the people who assaulted his attorney and stripped his files. Authorized access issued 3 weeks ago. Riker pulled the personnel file that Pruitt had attached. The access code was registered to a staff member, a junior paralegal who had joined Costello's firm 8 months prior. Standard background check, clean record, solid references. One of the references on examination was a law office in the financial district with a registered address that took Riker 4 minutes of cross-referencing to trace to a shell entity connected to the Vale family's legal infrastructure. He called Dax. "Get me everything on a paralegal named," he checked the file, "Marcus Hale. Costello's firm, 8 months. Now." He hung up and sat with his hands flat on the desk and breathed. Marcus Hale had been placed 8 months ago. The marriage negotiation had begun 10 months ago, which meant Edmund Vale had positioned an asset inside Costello's firm 2 months into the negotiation, before the contract was finalized, before the clause was embedded, before Riker had ever agreed to anything. The intercepted memo, the scrubbed recommendation, the clean entry into a secured building, this wasn't opportunistic. This had been built. Edmund Vale had been running an operation against him for the better part of a year, and Riker hadn't seen it. He stood up and knocked over the coffee without noticing and walked out of the study. He found Dax in the operations room on the ground floor, already on his phone. Dax looked at his face when he came in and ended his call mid-sentence. "Marcus Hale," Riker said. "Working on it. He's Vale's, 8 months embedded. He's the one who pulled Costello's memo before it reached me." Riker stopped in the center of the room. "Find out who inside my organization knew about the Costello arrangement. Who knew which firm I was using, who had access to the communication chain." Dax was very quiet for a moment. "You think Vale has someone in here too? I think a man who placed an asset inside my lawyer's firm 2 months into a negotiation didn't stop there." He looked at Dax steadily. "I'm not accusing anyone in this room. I'm telling you to run the audit. Everyone, including people you trust, including people I trust. Clean process, no shortcuts." Dax nodded once. "How long do you need the results?" 48 hours. "I'll have it in 36. He went back upstairs and stood in the corridor outside the east wing for a moment and then knocked on the door frame. She answered quickly, which meant she'd been awake, which he'd expected. She took one look at him. "Come in." He came in and sat in the chair by the window and told her what he knew. He didn't soften it. She sat on the edge of the bed. Not the floor, he noticed. She'd been sleeping in the bed for a week now, and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was looking at the window. "He planned this before the wedding," she said. "Yes. Before you and I ever—" She stopped. "He had people in place before I arrived here. That's what the timeline indicates." She absorbed this. "He knew you would eventually find out about the clause. He wasn't trying to hide it indefinitely. He was buying time and collecting documentation." She was working it through out loud, which he let her do. "He needed the marriage on record. He needed you visible and committed. And then he needed to be able to dissolve it on his terms and on his schedule. With Costello's internal records as part of his legal package, evidence that you entered the marriage under conditions that could be contested. Using a memo that your own attorney wrote. She looked at him. He's very good at this. He's been practicing on you for 23 years. She didn't flinch. She just sat with it. Then she said, "There's something else. Something you're not saying." He looked at her. "You came up here instead of staying downstairs and working," she said, "which means there's a piece of this you needed to say to a person instead of a phone." He was quiet for a moment. "I think someone inside my organization helped facilitate the breach. Someone who knew which firm I used. Possibly more than that." She looked at him steadily. "I'm running an audit," he said, "but until it's finished, I don't know who I'm looking at. And you can't trust your own people. I can trust some of them. I don't know which ones yet." She nodded slowly. He could see the processing happening behind her eyes. Not panic, which he would have understood, but something more controlled and somehow more troubling. The expression of someone who had grown up inside a situation where the people around her were not reliably safe and had developed over years the specific exhausted competence of managing that reality. "I know what that's like," she said quietly. "Living in a house where you don't know who's reporting to him." He said nothing. "You get very good at saying less than you're thinking," she said, "and watching for small things. Who goes where? Who talks to whom? What changes in behavior?" She looked at her hands. "I watched the staff in my father's house for years. The ones he owned and the ones who were just trying to do their jobs and stay out of it." She paused. "The ones he owned always stood a little differently when he entered a room. Not afraid. Anticipatory." "Anticipatory," Riker repeated, like they were waiting to see if they'd done what he wanted. He sat with that. "Think about who in your organization stood differently when this situation started," she said, "when the marriage arrangement was announced. Who changed?" He went back to his study and pulled security footage from the 6 weeks prior to the wedding. He spent 4 hours on it. He wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Dramatic was for people who didn't understand how information moved. He was looking for the small things. Who went where? Who talked to whom? He found it on the footage from week 3. A man named Garrett Cole, senior logistics coordinator, 11 years in the organization. He appeared 3 times in the footage having conversations in low-traffic areas of the building, the loading dock, the rear stairwell, the parking structure, with a driver whose vehicle registration, when Dax ran it, traced to a company that shared an accountant with Edmund Vale's primary charitable foundation. 11 years. Riker sat at his desk and felt the stone in his chest get heavier. He told Dax. Dax's face did something specific that Riker recognized. The expression of someone absorbing a betrayal from a person they'd sat across from at a table, repeatedly, over years. "How do you want to handle it?" Dax said. "Bring him in, not here, the secondary location, and do it quiet. I don't want him spooked before we have him in a room." "Tonight?" "Tonight." Nicole came into the room at the secondary location at 9:15 that evening, and he understood what it was the moment he saw Riker sitting at the table, because Cole had been in the organization long enough to know what that specific room was used for, and the color left his face in a way that confirmed everything before a word was said. Riker looked at him for a while without speaking. Cole stood near the door and his breathing was audible and his hands were at his sides making small involuntary movements. "Sit down," Riker said. Cole sat. "The Costello breach," Riker said. "Walk me through your involvement." "I don't," Cole started. "Don't." Riker's voice was very level. "I have your movements on 3 separate days cross-referenced against a vehicle registered to a Vale-connected entity. I have your communication records showing 3 gaps in the 48 hours before the breach that correspond to the planning window. And I have Garrett." He stopped. Cole's eyes had moved, just slightly, but they'd moved to the left, which was the direction of the door, which told Riker everything about what Cole was calculating. "Don't think about the door," Riker said. "Think about the next 10 minutes, because the next 10 minutes are the only ones you can still affect." Cole looked at the table. "How long?" Riker said. A long pause. 8 months, Cole said. His voice was flat, defeated in the specific way that defeat sounds when someone has been carrying a weight and the carrying is finally over. "He approached me through an intermediary, said he needed someone in your organization to monitor the communication structure around a specific legal negotiation. That was the framing, just monitoring. And the breach." Cole closed his eyes briefly. That came later, when the Ariston operation failed. He needed the files from Costello, and I was in by then. There wasn't a clean way out. Riker looked at him. You could have come to me. With what? I'd already been feeding information for 6 months. What was I going to tell you? You could have told me the truth. You would have. I know what I would have done, Riker said, but it would have been different from this. The room was quiet. Cole was looking at the table with the expression of a man reviewing a decision he'd made in a direction he couldn't walk back from. Riker stood up. There's one more thing, he said, and you're going to answer it accurately, because what happens next depends on what you say. Cole looked up. What does Vale know about her, about Serafina? Not the legal case, about her specifically, her location and the manner, her movements, her security. Cole's expression shifted by a degree. Something tightened around his eyes. Cole. He knows the East Wing layout, Cole said, from building records, and he knows the overnight security rotation from... He stopped. From what you gave him, Riker said. Cole said nothing. Riker walked out of the room. In the corridor, he stopped and stood with his hand flat against the wall and breathed through his nose and let the calculation run. The East Wing layout, the overnight rotation, the two pieces of information that, combined, told a person with resources and intent exactly when a specific room in this estate was most accessible. He called Dax while he was still walking. We need to move her tonight, he said. Not a different room, off the property, somewhere Vale's people don't have a file on. He was already going through the options. The Meridian Safe House. Get it prepped and get a car ready in the next 30 minutes. Is she an immediate... I don't know what his timeline is, and I'm not waiting to find out. He pushed through the exterior door into the wet night air. 30 minutes, Dax. He drove back to the manor faster than he should have on wet roads, and came through the front door at speed, and took the stairs to the East Wing in long strides and knocked on her door. She opened it quickly. She was dressed. She'd heard something in the movement of the house, the way people who grew up in dangerous places always heard something in the particular quality of an alert before it became an alert. We're leaving, he said. Now, take what you need for a few days. She looked at him. He knows the layout. Yes. She nodded and turned back into the room, and he watched her move without hesitation, pulling what she needed efficiently, no wasted motion, no panic, the competence of someone who had rehearsed departure in her mind many times without ever being allowed to actually leave. She had a bag packed in 4 minutes. She stopped at the door and looked at him. Riker. She said his name the way she'd never said it before. Not formally, not carefully, but with a specific weight that meant she'd arrived at a threshold of trust she wasn't walking back from. When this is over, whatever you have to do to end this, I need you to tell me. He held her eyes. All of it, she said. Not the version that protects me from the details. All of it. He was about to say yes, was about to make the assurance when his phone hit with a notification that sent everything he had planned into immediate collapse. It was from the monitoring system on the East Wing exterior, a camera positioned above the garden wall, one of 6 on the property perimeter. It showed 4 men moving along the estate's south wall in the dark, and it showed that they were already inside the perimeter. Move, he said, and grabbed her arm, and they were in the corridor and moving fast. And somewhere below them in the manor, a door came open that shouldn't have been open, and the sound of it reached them on the stairs like a hand closing around the back of the neck, because someone had a key. Someone who should not have had a key had a key. And the betrayal was deeper than Cole, deeper than 8 months of surveillance, deeper than anything Riker had. The staircase was dark and Riker had a wrist, and they were moving down, not up, because up was a dead end, and the sound from below had come from the east service entrance, which meant the south corridor was compromised. But the west passage through the kitchen might still be clean for another 40 seconds. And he was doing the geometry of the house in real time, the way he'd learned to do in rooms with fewer exits than this one. She didn't stumble. She didn't ask questions. She ran. He pulled her into the kitchen and put her back against the interior wall beside the refrigerator and held up one finger, and she froze. He listened. The house had a specific acoustic quality he'd learned over years of living in it, the way sound moved through the plaster walls, The way footsteps on the hardwood registered differently than footsteps on the stone passages near the utility rooms. What he was hearing now was two sets of movement. One in the east corridor behind them, one somewhere near the front hall, moving slow and deliberate, which meant they weren't panicking, which meant they had a plan and they were working it. He had his phone in his left hand. He texted Dax one word, kitchen. Then he put the phone away and pulled the knife from his belt. Not a gun, not yet, not in an enclosed space with her 2 feet from him, and looked at her face in the dark. Her eyes were steady, pupils wide but jaw set, breathing through her nose in the controlled way of someone managing fear with the specific musculature of long practice. "There's a door," he said, very low. "Behind the pantry shelving. It opens to the utility corridor that runs under the west wing. You've never seen it. Show me." He moved through the kitchen without turning on lights, navigating by the ambient glow from the security panel on the wall and the pale strip of emergency lighting near the floor. He found the pantry door and eased it open and moved 2 shelving units to the right along the track they'd been mounted on. He'd had this done 3 years ago, this specific modification, because he was a man who thought about exits, and the door behind them was steel, gray, flush with the wall. He got it open. The utility corridor was narrow, unfinished concrete, lit by a single bulb on a wire every 15 feet. It smelled like groundwater and electrical insulation, and it ran the length of the west wing and opened at the far end into the detached garage structure. He put her in front of him, and they moved. Behind them, back in the main house, something broke, glass or wood, one sharp crack followed by a voice he couldn't make out. The sound of someone realizing the room they'd entered was empty. The corridor was 60 feet. They covered it in under 20 seconds and came out through the steel door at the far end into the garage. 3 vehicles. The sedan was closest. He had keys because he always had keys, and they were in the car and moving before the garage door had finished opening, and he went out the service driveway on the north side of the property, not the main gate, because the main gate was where they'd expect him to surface. He drove with one hand and called Dax with the other. "We're out," he said. 4 men minimum, possibly more. They had a key to the service entrance. "I'm 15 minutes out. Where are you heading?" "The Meridian. Take the long route and confirm you're clean before you come in." He paused. "And Dax." Someone else gave them access. Not just Cole. Someone who had the service entrance code. A pause on the line. "I'll run it. Run it fast." He ended the call and drove. Serafina was in the passenger seat with her bag in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she was looking at the road ahead and not at him. And he recognized this as the specific posture of someone using movement, the act of going somewhere, to hold themselves together until the adrenaline metabolized into something manageable. He didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. Neither did she. Then she said, "How many people in your organization know about the Meridian Safe House?" "Fewer than you'd think." "How many?" "4, Sate," he said, "including Dax." She didn't say anything to that. "I know," he said. I'm not doubting Dax." "Neither am I." He moved through an intersection. "But I'm also not certain about anything tonight that I was certain about this morning, so I'm accounting for every variable." She was quiet for a moment. "Cole. The service entrance code. Could Cole have passed it?" "Cole had access to the security rotation. I don't know if he had the codes themselves." He paused. "Someone did." She turned her head and looked at him for the first time since they'd left the manor. "You built this organization for 17 years. "Yes." "And you're finding out tonight how much of it was built on someone else's foundation." He drove. The city moved past the windows, wet and orange lit, and he felt the weight of what she'd said settle into him in a way he didn't push back against, because it was accurate, and he'd developed over the years a specific intolerance for pushing back against accurate things just because they were uncomfortable. The Meridian Safe House was a 4th-floor unit in a residential building in the West District, the kind of building that was old enough to have no external cameras and new enough in its renovation to have had the interior completely rebuilt to his specifications. He'd owned it through 3 layers of holding companies for 6 years. It had been used twice, both times for short-term asset protection, and both times the people who'd been housed there had not known the address until they were already inside. He parked 2 blocks away and they walked. She matched his pace without being told to, stayed on his left, kept the same rhythm. He noticed this in the way he noticed the weight distribution of the bag in her hand, and the fact that she was scanning the street ahead with the peripheral vigilance of someone who had learned early that the person most likely to hurt you was the one you weren't currently watching. They got inside without incident. The unit was clean. He did a sweep out of habit, all 4 rooms, closets, the fire escape access. She stood in the main room and didn't hover, didn't ask where to put her things, just read the space the way a person reads a space when they've spent years learning to read spaces for safety. Dax arrived 40 minutes later. He came in with 2 of his people, Marin, who handled tactical logistics and whose comm was the kind of comm you could calibrate to, and a man named Soto, who was newer but whose instincts Riker had tested and found reliable. Dax looked at Serafina, then at Riker. "The manor is clear," he said. "They didn't stay. In and out." He set a tablet on the kitchen counter. 4 men confirmed from external footage. They went straight to the East Wing, spent approximately 6 minutes in the suite. "Looking for her," Riker said. "Looking for evidence of her. They went through the room, photographed it." Dax looked at the tablet. "Here's what I think they were doing. The original East Wing entry, the overnight rotation vulnerability, that was for extraction. She was supposed to be there, and they were going to take her out and make it look like she left voluntarily. But the timing got disrupted when we moved." He paused. "So they pivoted. They documented the room instead. For the legal filing. Her belongings, her personal effects, the condition of the space." Riker looked at him. "He's building a case that she's being held," Dax said. "That the living conditions, the floor sleeping, the isolation, the restricted movement, constitute evidence of coercion." He set the tablet down. "He's going to file within 48 hours, probably less. He needs to get to a judge before we can build a counter record." The room was very quiet. Serafina said, "He's going to use the floor." Everyone looked at her. "The East Wing room," she said. Her voice was measured. "He knows I was sleeping on the floor. He knows about the blanket, the untouched bed. He's going to present that as evidence that I was being kept in degrading conditions." She stopped. "He's going to take the thing that happened to me in his house and reframe it as something that happened to me in yours." Riker's hands were very still on the counter. "That's the filing," she said. "That's what Iris Tan was documenting. That's what the room photographs are for tonight." Dax said, "Yes, that's what we think." She nodded once. Something moved through her face that wasn't sorrow and wasn't anger. Something older than both. Something that had been in her a long time. "Okay," she said. "Then we need to talk about what we have." They worked through the night. Serafina sat at the table with Riker's legal analyst, a woman named Petra, who had been kept out of the Costello communication chain by design and was therefore clean. And they went through documentation, the log she'd kept from age 16. The letters. The scheduling records. Riker's team had also spent the past 2 weeks building a parallel file. Vera's written account of the household conduct since Serafina's arrival, the audio Iris Tan had inadvertently collected, the records of Serafina's garden project, the conversations with the oak tree specialist that had been conducted by phone and therefore time-stamped. Petra worked with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between a winnable legal case and a catastrophic one was often the organization of 2 specific documents. At 4 a.m, she looked up from the table and said, "We can fight the filing. It'll be close and it'll be ugly, but the counter record is real. The problem is the timeline. If he gets to a judge before we can submit the counter documentation, we could lose the first hearing on default position alone." "How much time do we need?" Riker said. "To prepare the full submission? 72 hours minimum. We have maybe 36. Petra looked at him. "Then we need something that shifts the position before the hearing, not just counter evidence on the coercion claim. Something that changes the geometry of the case entirely." He knew what she meant, and he'd been circling it for hours without landing on it, because the thing that would change the geometry of the case was the thing he didn't have documentation for yet, the full structure of Edmund Vale's financial misconduct against the Callaway Trust, the inheritance at the center of all of this. If he could demonstrate that the marriage itself had been orchestrated specifically to intercept Serafina's inheritance, the coercion claim inverted. Edmund Vale had not arranged a marriage to save his daughter from a crime figure. He had arranged a marriage to a crime figure as a mechanism for controlling his daughter's assets. The problem was that the financial trail into the Callaway Trust was embedded in 11 years of layered accounting, and 11 years of layered accounting didn't disassemble in 36 hours. Unless you already had the key. He looked at Serafina. She was looking at him. She'd been following his thinking. He could see it in her face, the way the same calculation was running. "My grandmother," she said. "Tell me about the trust structure." Callaway Family Trust, established by my maternal grandmother, Mira Callaway, before she died. I was the sole named beneficiary. Distribution at 25. She paused. My grandmother didn't trust my father. She'd never trusted him. The trust was structured specifically to prevent him from accessing the principal. The disbursement went directly to me, not through the Vale estate, not through any Vale-connected account. But he found a way in. He always finds a way. She looked at the table. There's a trustee, a man named Hargrove, Philip Hargrove. He was my grandmother's attorney, and he became the trustee after she died. He was supposed to be independent. She stopped. When I was 19, I tried to contact him directly, about the trust, about my rights under it. She was quiet for a moment. My father found out within 24 hours, which meant Hargrove told him. Riker was already reaching for his phone. If Hargrove is compromised, Petra said, and if there's a financial relationship between him and Edmund Vale that predates or coincides with his trusteeship, then the entire trust administration is tainted, Riker finished. Which means Vale's legal position on the inheritance isn't just ethically bankrupt, it's legally fraudulent. He looked at Serafina. Do you have anything on Hargrove? Any documentation of contact? I kept the letter, she said. The one I sent him. And I kept the response he sent back. It was very formal, very distant, and it referenced a conversation with my father that I'd never authorized him to have. Where is it? In the bag, she said. She pulled it toward her and opened it and went to an interior pocket and produced an envelope that had been folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. She put it on the table. Petra picked it up carefully. She read it. She looked up. This references a Vale family consultation, she said, from a trustee who, by the terms of the trust structure, should have had zero independent communication with the Vale family on beneficiary matters. Yes, Serafina said. This is the key, Petra said. She looked at Riker. If Hargrove has been compromised, if we can demonstrate a financial relationship between him and Vale, this letter is the thread that unravels 11 years of trust mismanagement. Riker called a forensic accountant named Lind, who operated in the financial district and whose specific talent was finding the architecture of how money moved when someone had spent considerable resources making sure it didn't look like it was moving. He woke Lind up. He explained what he needed. Lind said 36 hours was aggressive. Riker said aggressive was the only gear they had available and named a number that made Lind stop objecting. Dawn came. Serafina made coffee. She moved through the safe house kitchen with the same quiet efficiency she'd brought to every space she inhabited, finding what was there and working with it. And she brought a cup to the table where Petra was still working and put another on the counter near Riker without comment and went back to the table and sat. He watched her for a moment. This was a woman who had spent 23 years being managed as a resource by a man who had used every structure around her, legal, familial, financial, physical, as an instrument of control. And here she was in a safe house at 6 a.m, drinking coffee and reading legal documents with clear eyes and steady hands. He drank his coffee. By mid-morning, the shape of the counter strategy was assembled, and Petra had the filing structure drafted, and Lind had called back with a preliminary finding that was enough, not everything but enough, to support an emergency motion challenging the integrity of the trust administration itself. Then at 11:47, Dax came in from the street with a face that meant information Riker wasn't going to want to process on limited sleep and cold coffee. The hearing, Dax said. Vale moved the timeline. He filed this morning, emergency session. The judge he's using is a man named Creel. He stopped. We've seen Creel's name before. Riker looked at him. He's in Moss's network, Dax said. The political contractor. Creel has been on Moss's client list for 6 years. The hearing was set for 8 o'clock that evening. 7 hours. Riker put his cup down. Petra said, "We can file the countermotion now. If we can get it in front of a different judge..." "Creel will block the reassignment request," Riker said. "He has the procedural authority, and he'll use it." He moved to the window. The street below was ordinary, wet, people moving through their morning with the uncomplicated momentum of people who weren't currently watching a legal case that had been rigged from the foundation up converge on a courtroom in 7 hours. He thought. He went through it the way he went through everything, all the way to the end, to the worst version of the outcome, and then back from there to find the move that changed the ending. He turned around. "Hargrove," he said. "Where is Hargrove physically?" Dax pulled his phone. "Office in the financial district. He has a case conference this afternoon at 2. "We're going to be there." Petra looked up sharply. "You want to approach the trustee directly, before the hearing." "I want to give him a choice," Riker said. "The same choice I gave Cole. Between the version of tonight where he is a witness who came forward voluntarily with documentation of Vale's interference with the trust, and the version where we submit Lynn's accounting analysis alongside your motion and his name is in the first paragraph of every document we file." He looked at Petra. "People who've been doing something wrong for a long time don't always do it because they want to. Sometimes they do it because they've never been offered a clean way out." She looked at him carefully. "And if he refuses? Then we file everything and let Lynn's numbers do the talking, and we walk into that courtroom tonight and we fight it the hard way." The hard way. 7 hours. A judge who'd been bought, a filing built on manufactured evidence and 11 years of financial obstruction. He looked at Serafina. She was already standing. She'd heard every word, and she was standing with her bag over her shoulder and her coffee finished and her eyes on him with the full weight of everything they'd been building since that first morning in the kitchen. The oak trees and the floor and the library and the log written in handwriting so small it was almost invisible. And the letter she'd kept in the fold of a pocket for years because she'd known, even at 19, that someday it might matter. "Let's go," she said. They went. The city outside was bright and cold and indifferent, and Riker moved through it with the specific velocity of a man who had discarded every option except forward. And Serafina moved beside him, and the hearing was in 7 hours. And Philip Hargrove's office building came into view at the end of the block with its glass facade reflecting the gray sky. And somewhere above them on the 4th floor was a man who had spent 11 years standing at the hinge between justice and corruption and choosing the wrong side every single morning. He was about to be asked to choose differently, and in a courthouse across the city, in a chamber that had already been bought and arranged and made to look like justice, Edmund Vale was preparing to walk into the room where he believed he had already won. And he was wrong. But he didn't know that yet, and the moment he found out was going to be the most important moment of the next several hours. And everything. The counterfiling, Lynn's numbers, the letter in Serafina's bag, the oak trees and the floor, and the 17 years and the 43 pages of buried legal language. Everything was converging on a point that was still 2 hours away, and Riker Voss put his hand on the building's front door and pulled it open and did not look back because there was nothing behind him worth. Philip Hargrove was 61 years old, and he had the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades handling paper and the eyes of a man who had spent 11 years not looking directly at what the paper said. He was sitting behind his desk when Riker and Serafina came through the door of his 4th-floor office, and his assistant was still in the corridor saying something about an appointment that hadn't been scheduled, and Hargrove looked at Serafina's face, and whatever he'd been about to say died before it reached his mouth. He knew who she was. That was the first thing Riker noted. He didn't have to place her. He knew her immediately, and the knowing cost him something visible. Riker closed the door. "We have 4 hours," he said, "and I'm going to use the first 10 minutes of them here. After that, what happens to you is a function of what you decide in the next 10 minutes, not anything I do." Hargrove looked at Serafina. "Miss Vale, Mrs. Voss," she said. Her voice was even. "I've been Mrs. Voss for 2 months. You would know that if you'd responded to any of the 3 notifications my husband's legal team sent to your office." The old man's jaw moved. He looked at his desk. There was a legal pad on it, something he'd been working on before they arrived, and he put his hand over it in a gesture that was more reflex than strategy. "The letter," Riker said, "the one you sent her at 19, referencing a consultation with Edmund Vale that you had no authorization to conduct." He sat in the chair across from the desk. Not aggressively, just occupying the space the way he occupied all spaces. Completely. "We have it. We have 11 years of Lynn Financial's forensic reconstruction of the Callaway Trust Administration. We have the fee structures, the communication records, and 3 specific disbursements from the trust's operating account to a holding company that your name is adjacent to if you look at the registered agent filings carefully enough." Hargrove was very still. "I'm not a prosecutor," Riker said. "I'm not here to put you in a cell. I'm here because there's a hearing at 8 o'clock tonight in front of Judge Creel, and Edmund Vale is going to walk into that courtroom believing he has won, and I need to correct that belief before he gets there." He looked at the old man steadily. "You were Mira Calloway's attorney. She trusted you with the one thing she cared most about protecting, and you sold that trust for 11 years of fee arrangements and preferential access." He paused. "I'm giving you the chance to decide that the 12th year looks different." The room was quiet. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds: traffic, wind, the distant compression of a delivery truck's brakes. Hargrove looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. She didn't perform anything. No appeal, no accusation, no theater. Just looked at him with the full weight of 23 years of a life that had been managed and redirected and contained by men who had decided her needs were subordinate to their arrangements. The old man's hand moved off the legal pad. "What do you need?" he said. They were in Petra's office by 1:30, with Hargrove's voluntary disclosure statement being drafted in real time. It was 4 pages by 3 o'clock. By 4, it was 7 pages and included the specific dates of Edmund Vale's interference with the trust administration, the nature of the fee arrangement, and, most critically, a signed declaration that the marriage between Serafina Vale and Riker Voss had never been presented to Hargrove as anything other than a Vale family decision, with no indication from the trustees' required consultation that Serafina had entered the arrangement under duress. Petra filed the counter-motion at 4:47. The emergency submission to reassign the hearing away from Judge Creel went in simultaneously, supported by a separate filing documenting Creel's documented relationship with Carver Moss's political network, a filing that Riker's contacts in the city administrative structure had spent the last 18 hours quietly assembling. At 5:50, the reassignment was granted. The new judge was a woman named Alderman. Petra knew her by reputation. She said, on the phone, "She's not friendly to either side, she's just correct." This was exactly what Riker wanted. He told Serafina in the car on the way to the courthouse. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, and the city was going past the windows in the early evening light, and she received the information the way she'd received most information over the past weeks, steadily, without performance. "It's not over yet," she said. "No. He'll have something. He always has something. He has Creel, and Creel is gone. He has a coercion narrative, and Hargrove just dismantled it. He has a clause in a trust document, and that clause is now the centerpiece of a fraud filing, not a dissolution petition." Riker looked at the road. What he has left is a room full of expensive lawyers and the specific fury of a man who has never lost. She was quiet for a moment. "Have you?" "Have I what?" "Ever lost?" He thought about it honestly, which he always did with her questions because she had a way of asking them that made dishonesty feel structurally unsound. "Yes," he said, "twice. Both times I learned something I couldn't have learned any other way." She looked at him. "What did you learn tonight?" "Not tonight yet," he said. "Ask me at 9. The courthouse had that specific government building quality of spaces that have witnessed enormous amounts of human consequence and absorbed none of it. The marble floors and the fluorescent lighting and the smell of old paper and the weight of everything that had been decided in rooms like this without anyone in the corridors being any the wiser. Edmund Vale was already in the hall outside the courtroom when they arrived. He was with 2 attorneys and a man Riker recognized as one of Moss's associates, and he was the kind of man who had spent 60 years constructing an exterior so polished that most people never thought to look at the seams. He looked at Riker first. The calculation was fast and professional and revealed almost nothing. Then he looked at Serafina. and something moved through his face that was not calculation. Something older and uglier and more honest than anything else he'd shown in the years Riker had spent learning to read people in rooms. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone seeing a person they'd underestimated finally, irrevocably, in a position that couldn't be managed. Serafina looked at her father, and she did not look away. She did not look at the floor. She did not fold her hands or adjust her posture or find the middle distance. She stood in the corridor of the courthouse in the same gray she'd worn to a marriage ceremony 2 months ago that had been designed to make her invisible. And she looked at the man who had built her entire life around the premise that she would never hold this kind of ground, and she held it. Edmund Vale looked away first. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Judge Alderman read with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for documents that buried their substance, and she read everything. The dissolution petition, the countermotion, Hargrove's voluntary disclosure, Lynn's financial reconstruction, the supplemental on Creel's recusal. She asked 12 questions. They were precise and unapologetic, and twice they made Vale's lead attorney stop mid-sentence because the question had anticipated and dismantled the argument before it was finished. Serafina testified for 31 minutes. She sat in the chair and she answered questions in the same flat, even voice she'd used in the kitchen on that first morning, the voice that delivered facts without emotional weather, because the facts themselves were sufficient. She described her life in the Vale estate with the specificity of someone who had been keeping accurate records in her memory for 23 years because accurate records were the only protection available to her. She described sleeping on the floor. She described why. She described the log written in handwriting so small it was almost invisible and why she'd written it that way. She did not cry. She didn't need to. When Edmund Vale's attorney attempted to frame the floor sleeping as evidence of conditions at Blackthorn Manor, Judge Alderman looked at him over her glasses and said, "Counselor, the witness has explained the origin of that behavior with clinical precision. Do you have a question that addresses her testimony, or are you asking me to ignore it?" The attorney did not have a question that addressed her testimony. By 9:43, Judge Alderman had ruled. The dissolution petition was denied. The trust fraud filing was referred to the State Financial Crimes Division for formal investigation. Edmund Vale's access to Serafina's legal and financial affairs was suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. Hargrove's voluntary cooperation was entered into the record and would factor into whatever followed. In the corridor afterward, with the courthouse still humming around them and Petra shaking hands with someone, and Dax standing by the exit doing what Dax did in any room, which was know where all the doors were, Edmund Vale appeared. He had dismissed his attorneys. He walked to where Serafina was standing, and he stopped 4 feet from her, and his face had the particular set of a man who had lost something he'd believed was structurally impossible to lose. Riker was 1 step behind her. He stayed there. Edmund Vale looked at his daughter and said, "You don't understand what you've done." "I think I do," she said. "Everything I built. You didn't build it for me." Her voice was quiet, not angry, just accurate. "You built it around me. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of remorse. In his face it was something more complicated and less clean. The expression of someone confronting the distance between what they told themselves they were doing and what they were actually doing, confronting it too late to make it matter. "Your mother," he said. Then he stopped. "Don't," she said. Not loudly, just finally. He was quiet. She said, "You should go." He went. She stood and watched him walk down the corridor and through the doors and out of the frame. And she stood there until he was gone, and then she stood there a moment longer, and Riker watched the back of her head, and the set of her shoulders, and the way she breathed. 1 long breath, held, and then released through her nose slowly. Then she turned around. She looked at Riker. She said, "Okay?" Just that. Just the one word, with everything in it that couldn't be put in a word. The exhaustion and the end of something and the strange raw feeling of standing on ground that used to be occupied by a weight you'd carried so long its absence felt structural. He said, "Let's go home." They drove back to Blackthorn Manor in the dark. The oak trees along the drive were dark shapes against the sky, unpruned still, their roots in the broken pavement. The front lights were on. Vera had left them on. Inside, the house was quiet and warm. Vera had also left food on the kitchen counter, the specific kind of food that required no preparation, that was simply there for people who would come home too tired to cook, but who needed to eat. She had not waited up. She had simply anticipated and provided and gone to bed, which was its own form of fluency in the language of care. They sat at the kitchen counter and ate without much talking. At some point, Serafina said, "The oak tree specialist. Did Dax ever—" "Next week," Riker said. "Tuesday." She nodded. They ate. He refilled her water glass without being asked, and she thanked him without looking up from her food. And there was in that exchange the specific texture of two people who had been through enough together in a short enough time that the ordinary gestures had accumulated weight. Later, when the food was done, and the kitchen was quiet, and the house settled into its nighttime sounds, she said, "I want to do something with the East Wing sitting room, the south-facing windows. There's enough light in there for plants. Real ones. I want to put in a proper window garden." He looked at her. "All right. I've been thinking about it for a few weeks. I kept not saying it because it felt—" She stopped. "I kept waiting for permission. Old habit. You don't need permission." "I know." She looked at her water glass. "That's what I'm practicing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a nursery in the North District. Good reputation. I'll get you the contact." She looked at him. Something in her expression that was small and unperformed and real. "Thank you. It's a phone number." "It's not just a phone number." He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them elaborated on what it was, because the thing it was didn't require elaboration between two people who both already understood it. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Not dramatically. The investigation into Edmund Vale's trust administration proceeded through its institutional channels with the grinding deliberateness of financial crime proceedings, and Hargrove's cooperation made the foundation of it solid, if not fast. Carver Moss's network was named in a parallel inquiry that emerged partly from the Creel recusal filing. Cole was processed through Riker's own accountability structure. The outcome of that was not discussed publicly, and Dax handled the mechanics of it with his characteristic efficiency and discretion. Costello recovered. He was back in his office within 3 weeks, and the first thing he did was send over the complete original memo, the one that had been intercepted before it reached Riker, accompanied by a note that said simply, "I should have verified delivery." Riker kept the note. Marcus Hale, the paralegal Edmund Vale had placed in Costello's firm 8 months before the wedding, was identified, and the details of his operation were handed to the financial crimes investigators as supplemental material. He was 19 months into a career he was not going to finish. The spring came. The oak trees were pruned by a specialist who spent 2 days on the drive, and who told Serafina afterward that they were the oldest stand of oaks he'd worked with in 15 years of the profession, and that whoever had planted them had known what they were doing. She relayed this to Riker over dinner. He said he'd have someone look into the estate history. She did. The East Wing sitting room became what she'd described in the kitchen that night, a window garden, dense and green, with the kind of plants that required attention and rewarded it. Vera helped her source several of them. They had, during this process, developed the particular friendship of two women who communicate most efficiently through the combined language of task and commentary. Serafina launched the first phase of a charitable initiative through a foundation she established in her grandmother's name, the Callaway Foundation, formally, focused on legal advocacy for minors in situations of familial financial abuse. The connection to her own history was not hidden and not performed. She stated it plainly in the Foundation's initial documentation, that she had personal experience with the specific mechanisms the Foundation intended to address, and that this was the reason she was qualified to address them. Petra handled the legal architecture. Two organizations that had been doing adjacent work in the city came forward with offers of partnership within the first month. She ran the Foundation's early operations from the library at Blackthorn Manor, from a desk she'd set up in the south corner near the tall windows. Riker passed through occasionally, on his way between the study and the kitchen, between meetings, at the end of long operational days. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and both were fine. On an evening in late spring, Riker came up to the second floor after a call that had gone longer than expected and found the East Wing sitting room light on. He looked in. The window garden was dark at this hour, just shapes and shadows, but the room smelled like soil and green things. Serafina wasn't there. He went to the end of the corridor and came to their suite. The arrangement of shared space that had evolved without formal discussion, the way things between them had consistently evolved through accumulation rather than declaration, and he opened the door quietly. The room was dim. The small lamp on the far side was on. She was in the bed, not on the floor, not beside it. In it, on her side, the blanket pulled up, asleep in the way a person sleeps when they have laid down without calculating whether they were allowed to, without checking the room's dimensions or the proximity of the door or any of the old reflexive assessments. Just asleep. He stood in the doorway for a while. The window was open an inch, and the late spring air came through it, carrying the smell of the grounds and the distant sound of the city beyond the iron gates. He thought about the first night, the sedan in the rain and the single suitcase, and the eyes that didn't rise above the floor. The 11-minute phone call. The kitchen table and 2 hours of flat-voiced facts delivered without weather around them. The log written in handwriting almost too small to read. The letter folded to softness in the pocket of a bag. He thought about what she'd said, asking him not to let Edmund Vale make him into something he'd regret. He thought about what he'd said at 9 o'clock in the car, when she'd asked him what he'd learned. He hadn't answered then. He answered it now, quietly, in his own head, standing in the doorway, while the city went on outside and the window garden breathed its green smell into the room. He'd learned that protection was something he'd always understood as a structural matter. Walls, personnel, contingencies, exits. He'd been building structures for 17 years, good ones, sound ones, and he'd believed this was sufficient. He'd learned that there was a different kind of protection that had nothing to do with walls, that it was slower and required more attention than any security protocol he'd ever designed, and that its construction was ongoing and could not be delegated, and that it was the only kind that actually mattered to the person inside it. He'd learned this from watching her practice knowing she was allowed to be happy, from watching her say the words "I wasn't permitted," and then, months later, tell him she wanted a window garden with the straightforward ease of someone asking for something they expected to receive. From the way she'd looked at her father in the corridor of that courthouse, not with triumph, not with hate, just with the clear eyes of someone who had stopped waiting to be released and had released herself. He crossed the room quietly. He sat on the edge of the bed on his side. His side, a designation that had arrived without announcement and stayed. And he reached over and turned off the small lamp and sat in the dark for a moment. Outside, the iron gates of Blackthorn Manor stood as they always had. The city beyond them had its ongoing opinion of Riker Voss, which was unchanged and would remain unchanged because cities had no mechanism for processing the private interior of a public reputation, and he had no interest in offering them one. Inside the room was dark and still. He lay down. Beside him, Serafina made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, not alertness, just the unconscious acknowledgement of a presence she had decided, somewhere below the level of decision, to trust. He looked at the ceiling. The oak trees outside would be pruned again next fall. The east window garden would need repotting before the summer heat. The Callaway Foundation's second phase was scheduled to launch in August, and Serafina had already been working on the documentation with a focus that made Petra describe her as the most organized client she'd ever had. The financial crimes investigation would proceed for another 18 months probably, before anything final happened to Edmund Vale, and when it did, Riker would not be in the room because it wasn't his room to be in. That resolution belonged to her and to the institutional machinery she'd set in motion, and he understood that clearly, and it was fine. Everything that needed closing had been closed. He breathed in the dark, and the room was quiet around him, and the city outside the window continued its operations. And after a while his eyes closed the way eyes close when a person is, for the first time in longer than they can accurately measure, not waiting for anything. He slept.